Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl podcast, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. The Tough Girl podcast is sponsorship and ad-free thanks to the monthly financial support of patrons. To find out more about supporting your favourite podcast and becoming a patron, please check out Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl podcast and help me to increase the amount of female role models in the media. Take action now and become one of them. All patrons will get their name on a dedicated patrons page on the Tough Girl website. All female patrons $5 and above are invited to join the closed Facebook group, the Tough Girl Tribe. Today, I'm delighted we're going to be speaking to Alyssa Azar, who is the youngest Australian to summit Mount Everest, which she did at 19 years old. Alyssa is also the youngest woman to summit Mount Everest from both the north and south sides after successfully reaching the summit of Mount Everest from the north side in Tibet in 2018 when she was just 21 years old.
So I'm Alyssa Azar and I am an Australian mountaineer, but really how I got into it, so my background, I grew up in, small town suburbs in Australia and was really, really active, loved a lot of sports as a kid. And it just so happened that my dad was a trekking guide. So he was in the army and he part-time worked on the Kokoda Track, which for most Australians is a pretty famous trek that a lot of them will go and do, a 96-kilometre jungle trek, very steep through Papua New Guinea. And so he would professionally guide people across there, sometimes 3 up to 10 times a year. And most of my weekends from sort of 5 or 6 years old, I was out bushwalking just around our local trails with a lot of the clients that he would train up to go and do this trek. And I just loved it. And I think just being around it, hearing a lot of the stories of Kokoda and, anyone who would go would talk about how life-changing it was. And I always knew, okay, I want to go and do that someday, and pretty much started harassing my parents about it straight away. Initially, it was a lot of no's. There's no way you're going to do that. A couple of years later, my dad actually said, all right, look, if you're willing to do the training and you're willing to put in the same effort as anyone else, regardless of age, then I'd be willing to give you the opportunity to go. And so, had to prove over the course of a year that I could train consistently and put in the work required. And then in August 2005, we went and trekked across the Kokoda Track. And that was really my introduction to adventure and all that sort of thing. And so, it was certainly life-changing and just the physical and mental challenge for me. I loved it. And then, every couple of years we would try and take on a trek somewhere if we could. So then it was Everest Base Camp. And then after that, it was the Aussie 10 peaks, the 10 highest peaks in Australia, all in Kosciuszko National Park. And then 2 years after that, which was actually my biggest challenge at the time, I was 14 and we went and climbed Mt Kilimanjaro. And at that time, it's the highest altitude I'd been to, and it was incredibly challenging. But really that set me on the path to Everest. For me, Kilimanjaro was, I'd had Everest in the back of my mind for a few years, but I really didn't know any mountaineers, mountain climbers. I didn't even know how to get into that sort of world. I didn't know what was required, but that's really what I set about doing when I got back from Kilimanjaro. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to get into, the mountains and climbing, and that really set me on the path for that, which then became sort of a few-year process where I focused on Everest before I summited in 2016.
Absolutely incredible. I love how you shared that. I'd love to know more about your relationship with your parents and your dad, and just that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so we have quite a small family, I guess, growing up. I didn't have a lot of extended family, so it was pretty much my mum, my dad, and then my siblings and I. But it was great, loved it. So it was interesting, and growing up it was almost like having these two worlds, the one of adventure, which sort of my dad and I would go and do, and then when I was at home with mum and my siblings, it was actually very normal, normal school stuff, normal family activities, that sort of thing. But I'm quite close with both my parents, particularly growing up in different ways. And so they both had, a pretty big impact on me. But certainly my dad, because I think I was just fascinated by some of the work that he did. He was so passionate about his job guiding people across Kokoda. And I think for me, it was like, oh, I want to find something one day that I'm passionate about like that I can go and, sort of do every day. And so that was definitely inspirational for me. But yeah, it's, we've always been quite close. I spent a lot of my time sort of training with him throughout my earlier years. But yeah, definitely close and impacted by both my parents.
What about, so I mean, almost going back to when you were 14 and taking on like Kilimanjaro, when you shared that with sort of like your school friends, hey, this is what I'm going to be doing, did they understand what it was, or what were the reactions of maybe your school friends or your parents' friends?
Through a lot of these trips, and certainly with Kilimanjaro, my school friends fully didn't understand what that was. As in, they knew I was going away and I was doing some sort of hiking, but it was a totally different world. So really, I understood that it is like being in two different worlds. And when I'm out there, they've definitely got no concept of, I guess, what I'm doing, because it's pretty out there for them. And certainly, my parents' friends and all of that, I think there was a lot of, even though they didn't say it to us, there was a bit of sort of judgment and criticism throughout the times that I was just very young and doing a lot of these big treks, because there's sort of things that a lot of adults will get nervous taking on. So there's certainly questions of whether you should be doing it or are you capable of doing it and all of that. But yeah, I think it's just about being willing to sort of make your own decision, and sometimes you've got to tune a little bit of that out.
Absolutely, and I can imagine that that's actually only grown over the years, especially as you've got a little
Absolutely.
bit,
Yes.
and a little bit older. You talked about coming back from, Kilimanjaro, and that obviously had quite an impact on you, and it sort of helped you make that decision about wanting to go and climb Mount Everest. I'd love to know more about that thought process and how it developed and why it became so important to you.
I guess, Everest for me was something I was fascinated with, but until I did Kilimanjaro, it wasn't like I'm definitely like 100% going to do that. Up until then, it was kind of this, like, I heard about it when I was quite young. You read about the world's highest mountain in a book at school, and it's like, oh, that's fascinating. This is the world's highest mountain. And I think in the back of my mind, I was always like, oh, I wonder if I could climb that. But yeah, when I was 14 and when we were on Kilimanjaro, I had a few things going on. I wasn't particularly happy in school. I found it a bit of a struggle, not so much even the academic side. I quite enjoyed the learning, but I definitely struggled socially. I think because, the bigger and bigger these trips got, the more I was doing it, the more I sort of felt like an outcast, because it was this world that a lot of the people in my school just didn't get. So I kind of just was doing my own thing, and I was on Kilimanjaro, and one of the great things I do love about, treks and being in the mountains, it really does give you a lot of time and space to reflect and think. And I sort of used that trip, obviously, both as its own challenge, but I also used it to sort of have a break from everything at home and really think about what I wanted. Particularly as I was starting to sort of get to the last few years of high school, and started to think, right, what's the future going to look like? And I knew that I had to sort of set some goals for myself that really aligned with who I was, and not what I thought I had to do. And so that was kind of the thought process behind it. I remember we'd summited Kilimanjaro. We were probably about most of the way back down the mountain, and we're about to head back to where we were staying in Africa. And that's when it really started to play on me that, I loved being in the mountains, and if I could do as much of that as possible in my future, that's what I wanted to do. And that's really when I remembered, I guess, Everest, and the fact that this had been something that had fascinated me my whole life, and it's something that I'd hoped to someday do. I then went, you know what, I'm going to set this goal. And again, I don't know anyone who's done it. I don't know what's required, but the goal for me was then, as soon as I get home, I need to start researching it. I need to work out what's involved, and really I didn't know how long that was going to take. Will I summit in 10 or 15 years? Then that's when I do, but I wanted to start working toward it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is almost it can be like sort of the role models that you have in life, and you can become similar to the people that you're closest to, and obviously having your dad doing like all the trekking and giving you the opportunity to go and do these the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea and heading off to Mount Kilimanjaro. You're mixing with like-minded individuals who are pushing themselves and challenging themselves. What about role models? Did you have any female role models when you were growing up? Because I'm trying to think back to when I was your age, and I didn't even know women were out there doing this. One of the reasons I started the Tough Girl podcast was to share these incredible stories. Did you have many role models growing up?
I actually didn't, funnily enough. I mean, there's a few sort of here and there. I mean, like you said, I actually just had no concept that women did this sort of stuff. I'd never heard of any, sort of adventurous type women. Obviously, I was around some in the trekking sense, but I didn't know any that were doing it at, the world's highest level, I guess. And even not that many, even within sort of our trekking circles and that. So not so much in the adventure space, funnily enough, but I would say definitely my mum was one. I remember being really little, and so she was also in the army, and just she took her physical training really seriously. And I think just being around that culture of both my parents were quite physically fit and committed, that certainly was something that she was a role model for me when I was younger. And I think like younger years I was into a little bit of boxing as well, so certainly. And I got to meet an Australian boxing champion, a world champion, Sharon Anyos. So that, she was a role model to me. But, there really weren't a lot, I think. And it was also just, again, like just not having access to them. Back then, you kind of, didn't really hear a lot of these stories.
Yeah. So you were 14 when you climbed Kilimanjaro in 2011. And you went to go and summit Mount Everest, which you did at 19 in 2016. Talk me through that 5-year time period, coming back, doing your research, figuring out how to make this a reality. What were the steps involved?
Yeah, so got back from Kilimanjaro, and really I told my dad, I said, look, this is what I want to do. And he was on board and said, look, I'll support you wherever I can and, help you out whenever I can. But really it was a world that neither of us knew, that whole expedition climbing. And so I started to do my research. I looked into, all right, what are the skills I need? Obviously I need to be incredibly physically fit, but how do you also make sure your mind's in the right place? And then you've got the technical skills that you need as well. Then you start looking at the logistics of the expedition. And so the starting point for me was I was able to go and do a climbing course in New Zealand. So not too long after Kilimanjaro, actually, it was sort of the end of the year. I went and, did about 10 days just over in Mount Cook National Park area. And that's where I started learning a lot of the technical stuff I never had before. So we did a bit of ice climbing, just learning all the mountaineering gear, which was totally new to me. I'd never put a set of crampons on. So we did all of that and just roping up in glacier travel and all this sort of stuff. And then from there, it was just about, sort of laying out the next few years and piecing together all of the things that I would need on that expedition. Whenever I could climb, obviously I would, but financially it was pretty tight as well. It wasn't always possible. So a lot of my training was done in Australia. So I would follow a physical training program just at home, and then with a coach. And then I would also do these training camps. So, it was about seeking out mentors and the right people, I guess, to learn from both physically and mentally. So one of those for me was actually, he was a friend of my dad's, but I hadn't met him at the time. And his name's Keith Fennell. So he was the youngest person to make it into the Australian SAS. So he totally understood being really young and taking on, I guess, such a massive challenge. So what happened is basically, my dad said to me, look, I think you should go and do, just a couple of days sort of training camp with this guy, just to, he's both going to get a sense of whether he thinks you're ready, but also, just for me to sort of get a bit of that mindset and learn from him. So that's what I went and did. I went down to Sydney in Australia, spent a few days down there, and we did all sorts of things from roping skills to, pack walking and all that sort of thing. But yeah, basically every few months I would have to sort of put my training to the test in some way, just to make sure that I was progressing and getting to where I needed to go. And so when I was 17, I then had a climbing expedition to the Andes, and this was not long before I had my first attempt on Everest. So this is early 2014. I'd been training for a few years at this point, just a lot of that sort of physical training at home. And this was the team that I was looking at climbing on Everest with. So they said, look, we're doing this climb on Aconcagua in the Andes. It'd be a great expedition experience for you, but also we'll get to see obviously how you perform and you'll get to know the team. So I was able to go on that one. And so I spent about 3 weeks in early January over climbing in the Andes, and certainly one of the best expeditions I've ever had. Just getting that experience at nearly 7,000 meters in altitude. I was really happy with how I performed. It was an incredibly tough expedition, but yeah, it was a really, really good trip, and they were happy and confident in my ability after seeing how I performed on Aconcagua. And so then only a couple months later, I flew to Nepal, and we were setting out to attempt Everest. So 2014, we then, did the trek into Everest Base Camp, and that sort of becomes your home away from home. We'd been there for only a week when there was an accident in the Khumbu Icefall, the first section on the mountain, that killed 16 Sherpas. So straight away, pretty much as soon as we walked into base camp or a few days after, one of the biggest accidents in Everest history happens, which, was pretty full on. And certainly that was my first experience climbing on an Everest expedition. So it reminds you how real, obviously, the risks are. And obviously the season was cancelled and we all went home. So after that, just decided, after about a few months, kind of sat on it and then decided, look, at some point I do want to go back. I was able to return the next year in 2015. Same thing, so we trekked into base camp. I was with the same team, and we'd been there for a couple of weeks this time, and I remember getting up, it was like 2:00 in the morning, and we were meant to start our first day of climbing on Everest. And one of the head Sherpas came over in base camp and said, it's been a lot of snowfall overnight, which makes that very first section of climbing even more dangerous than usual. So we're going to delay it one more day. We'll have a rest day in base camp. And so we said, yeah, no problem. We'll go tomorrow. And then later that same day at about midday, the Nepal earthquake hit, which was obviously devastating for the country. But at the time, we had no idea how big this thing was because we were pretty isolated in base camp. And so I remember the earthquake hitting, and then this massive avalanche got triggered in Everest Base Camp. And some people were killed in base camp, and it was even worse than the season before. So straight off the bat, though, those were my, 2 first expedition experiences on Everest. And that second one was incredibly tough to pick myself back up from. And at this point, I'd been training for this for a solid, 4 or 5 years. And so it was incredibly difficult to have to not only walk away from it, but in the way that it happened, the devastation in Nepal. I went home. I continued, just physically training, but I honestly didn't know whether this thing was going to happen or not. And I'd kind of pushed it to the back of my mind and just went, all right, I'm just going to keep physically training more for myself. And if someday the opportunity comes up, then we'll look at it. About 6 months went by, and I don't remember what it was exactly, but I think after speaking to, some of the locals over there, some of the Sherpas, and trying to get sort of the lay of the land of what was happening, one of them, said to me, look, we want to have a positive season on Everest. And I think everybody felt that, and they were actually keen for people to come back. And so that kind of started to sway me, and I was like, look, I don't want to quit on this. So I decided to go and have a third attempt. And that's when I finally successfully summited Mount Everest. So it was my third attempt in 2016.
I mean, massive congratulations and incredible achievement. Obviously, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I just want to discuss more about having been on Everest twice and very sort of traumatic and very scary situations, and dealing with the loss of life and the realities of being over there in that environment, and realizing sort of how fragile it is. And how did you deal with your emotions?
So it's definitely challenging. For me, I find that when I am over there, not that you're unemotional, but I just find that you do sort of deal with it more when you get home. I certainly found that after the 2015 earthquake. Once that hit, and I think like straight away, it was just about being really clinical, because something I understood is at the end of the day, whatever happens, really your power is in the way that you respond to it. And that became really clear to me, years climbing on expeditions and having these sort of experiences. It's like, look, you just don't know what the mountain's going to throw at you, but you need to respond in the best way possible, and that will get you the best outcome. So for me, it was like, look, yes, this happened, but straight away was getting into, all right, how do we handle it? How do we help? How do we, whatever we can do. And then certainly when I got home, for a few weeks in particular, it's a process, because just the magnitude of what happened, nobody saw that coming. And you kind of expect that things could happen on, at the end of the day, it's Everest, but that was so far outside of what anyone thought. And the loss of life was much, much larger than anything we could have imagined. So, it definitely took some time to work through. But certainly when I'm on the mountain, I'm aware that, I've got to respond really quickly and in the right way. And that's actually something that I remember discussing with Keith, who was one of my mentors. And he said to me, look, when you're in these sort of environments, you want to try and imagine throughout your expedition that there's this perfect performance line. So if everything went exactly the way we want it to, and we know it won't, what does that line look like? And every time something takes you off that path, you want to make decisions that get you even 1% closer to it. You want to be trying to get back to that, I guess, perfect performance line where things are where we want them to be. And so that kind of gave me a good, mind map as well on dealing with things. Sometimes, yes, it's natural to be emotional when those sort of traumatic events happen. But I guess just through training, just through, conversations with some pretty high level people like that, and then, implementing it, I got pretty good at that by the time, that earthquake and other events hit. So I was just good at going, all right, look, what do we need to do in order to get back to where we need to be? And so that certainly helped me over there.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love to know how you kept your focus from having this dream, having this idea, to heading out in 2014 and 2015, and to and heading back again in 2016. I'm trying to think I'm trying to think what I was like as a teenage girl. How did you keep focused on this dream and not get distracted with teenage life?
Yeah, look, it was challenging. I think there's a couple of things. One is that, again, this goal, as much as, it was great to, want to go and climb Everest, I think it was next level for me in that, I was obsessed with it and I was really aligned with what I was doing. For me, it was the most important thing in the world at the time. It outranked everything else. And I think also by that point, a lot of the treks I'd done, I'd kind of put myself through a similar process before of setting that goal, I guess seeing it through, embracing that delayed gratification that it takes. I think through that, and then also just naturally, I liked having that really big goal that you've got to just consistently chip away at. I realized how fulfilling that is in the long run. So I guess I understood, for me, the benefits of pursuing it outweighed, I guess, any negative side to it, because it certainly is difficult when you are 3-4 years into a process, and also you add in, okay, maybe it won't happen because of all these incidents that have gone on, and have we worked this hard for nothing? And you certainly have those thoughts, but for me it was about particularly returning for my third attempt. It was really important to get my head in the right place. I didn't want to go into another attempt not 100%, because I thought, then what happens if you get the opportunity and you're simply not ready? So I knew I used a lot of my training going into the third attempt to not only physically train, but really just to overcome a lot of any sort of mental, weaknesses, whether it was like, am I doubting myself? Am I doubting the expedition? Am I, and there was all of that there. So certainly it was a process. But by the time I had finished that sort of last 6 months of training, I felt like I was in a really good place going back into it. But it's incredibly challenging to hold your focus for that long. I guess for me, it's just making those consistent choices that this big goal means more to me than all the other small stuff, and definitely making those sacrifices.
And Alyssa, one of the things that I want or I've been trying to talk about more is the money and the financing of adventures. How did you pay for this, or did your parents pay for it, or if you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So look, the financial side, I'd set this goal without even knowing how that was going to come together. So like I said, I thought, okay, I could be going in 10 or 15 years. I just know at some point I want to do this. And so mainly it was sponsorship. So my family didn't have the money, and I certainly didn't have the money. And so mainly through sponsorship. My major gear and expedition sponsor is Mountain Designs here in Australia. But even before I had them on board, just a few like local businesses where I lived assisted in it as well. But yeah, it was kind of a mixture of things where he could. My dad helped out as well. And actually, we as a family owned a gym a few years ago, and it was time to sell that anyway, and some of that went toward the expedition. So it was kind of a mixture of things that, you've just kind of got to try and piece a lot of that together. I wasn't sure at the start how that was all going to come together, and often the financial side is one of the biggest obstacles, obviously, in trying to do this sort of stuff. So yeah, we didn't really know if Everest was possible, and I think the fortunate thing for me is I'd done a lot of these adventures already quite young, and as a result I had a few sort of records of being the youngest, and the simple fact, which we didn't realise when I'd initially set this goal, we didn't know that I would become the youngest Australian to do it. We kind of assumed that would already be taken or someone would have done it. Because there was the potential of that, it definitely attracted sponsors. So yeah, it was just kind of a mixture of all those things. It's just keeping your story out there and keep sharing what you're doing and all that sort of thing. But yeah, mainly sponsors.
Yeah. You talked about having a team when you went to Everest. Could you share more about like how big was the team, who was part of it, what your role was in the team?
Yeah, so it's actually quite an interesting dynamic on Everest, particularly these days. So by the time I summited, I'd actually chosen to go with a different team because I did realise how crucial that is. So, when I went to the Andes and I was climbing with a particular team, they were a mixture of, there was an Australian leader and then there was a South African leader. And then obviously the local guides, and a lot of the clients were South African and a couple of Australians, including myself. And look, they were a really good team in a lot of ways, but there were some issues as well. And I spent my first 2 seasons that didn't work out climbing on Everest with them. And certainly I think it made me realise how important it was just to find the right team in terms of like attitude toward the climb. I found on Everest that with that particular team, a lot of people, unfortunately, were quite underprepared, weren't that physically fit, and even just their attitude of they didn't take it very seriously or thought nothing could go wrong. And I'd been trained by that point the total opposite: be ready for what could go wrong and be ready to manage and handle those situations. So there were certainly some clashes, and then there were some people in the team that were just great to be climbing with, and and all of that. So we had a mixture. So we had that team, I'd say, was about 8 people. Some we had from the UK on our second expedition, but mostly it was South African and Australian climbers. When I had my third attempt on Everest, I went with a different team. So I went with a logistics company based in Nepal that I climbed with years ago previously, and they were great. So they're a Sherpa run and owned company, which means we're working one-on-one with the Sherpas, and it's really good though because they set a standard of what your climbing ability needs to be, and that you really need to perform on the mountain before they'll let you go for a summit push. And so we had a whole mixture. We ended up having 12 climbers, and we had one from Poland, one from India. We had, just a whole mix, some Australians, and it was really good. I found that I much preferred climbing with the team that I went with in 2016 than the previous ones. But it was really good. That's, I think, one of the reasons it's really good if you can, certainly to gain that expedition experience. You start to get the lay of the land. You start to understand, I guess, the teams and who's who, and can then make a choice on who you want to climb with. So that's what I did on my third attempt on Everest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting with the team dynamics, and I wonder how much did your age come into those teams? Did you have people almost thinking, oh, great, we've got to be responsible for this young girl now?
100%. Yes, 100%. That was, even if they didn't say it, you could tell it was just kind of like, oh no, we're going to, can she even carry a pack? 100%. So I could feel that going into it. And I, particularly when people go, how old are you? And you go, 19, and you can see they get nervous about that. For me, it was about, I knew as soon as the climb started that, once they see that you can actually perform, and I did see this throughout the expedition, all of those concerns and doubts tend to just fade away. Once they see that, okay, you can actually climb consistently, back to back on these big climbing days, you can handle this, it makes them feel more comfortable then. But certainly you can feel some nerves and doubts from people when you start the expedition and they just don't know you yet.
I think that's particularly challenging because not only are you having to manage your own personal fears, your mental mindset, everything else that's going on, but also you're maybe, you might not even have been, were you thinking about other people's things, or was it not even, did you care what other people thought?
I mean, look, half and half. So I'd say I didn't mostly. For me, the goal was the most important thing, and I think I let that sort of mainly take up what I was focusing on. So I was like, look, just do things that you can do to the best of your ability. But, it was certainly a factor. It's hard for that not to impact you. I was mostly focused on the climbing aspect and the mountain, but you do feel it when people sort of question, oh, should you be here? And again, I felt like, well, I've put in as much work as anyone to be here. But, it does impact you. You feel, I guess, more like, as nice as some of them tried to be, there's times where you go, am I really accepted here? Am I really on this team? Do they not want me here? So some of that does start to play on you. And for me, it was just about refocusing on, my reason for being here and the climb itself.
Yeah, tell us more about summiting Everest at 19 on the 21st of May 2016.
Yeah, I mean, look, right up until then, really until the last hour, you just don't know what's going to happen. Weather can come in. So I remember throughout that 2 months of climbing on Everest, and I just kept saying to myself, focus on each day, take each task as it comes. And honestly, it was incredibly, incredibly tough as expected, but I actually had the best time. I loved it. The whole experience, living in base camp, and certainly the nerve-wracking experience of climbing up through the ice wall the first time. But for me, it was like, oh, finally get to actually experience this for myself. Climbing up through the icefall, climbing up to Camp 2. We did a few of those rotations to acclimatise, so we go up and back and up and back. And but I absolutely loved it. And I remember getting to Summit Day. So we climbed for about 7 hours from Camp 3, which is halfway up the Lhotse face, pretty big ice wall. Takes a couple of days to climb that one. We then climbed for 7 hours onto Camp 4, and that's where you really start to feel the nerves and excitement, because you know you're now about to be in the death zone. So that's the final day on Everest, the final climb, that final summit push. So I remember getting there. We don't really sleep at Camp 4, so we spend a few hours there. You try and eat and drink if you can, but it's pretty tough at that altitude. And so you just kind of rest as much as you can. And then I'd sort of heard rumours from some of the Sherpas, there might be some winds coming in. We don't know what's going to happen with the weather. And so once we got to Camp 4, I half expected we were going to be turned around, and I thought, hope it goes ahead. And, we then got the call and said, all right, we're leaving at 8 o'clock tonight. And, yeah, certainly the nerves and excitement of it's happening. This is the final day. I really didn't know what to expect. So I felt like, I wonder if it's going to be that much harder than any other day on the expedition and being at those altitudes. But once we got into the climb, I just totally got into my rhythm, and it was tough, but I actually felt really, really strong on summit day. So we climbed really steep sections and pretty fresh snow. So we're like breaking trail at over 8,000 meters, and climbed up to a section called the balcony on Everest. And that's where you start to really go up this ridge line to the last section of the climb. And yeah, it wasn't until the last hour we got to a point called the South Summit. And that's, a false summit. You get to there, and that's where you see the final ridge line, the Hillary Step, all of that. And it was just my Sherpa and I climbing together, and we were the first up that morning, and he said only an hour away. And I remember thinking, oh, that's fast. Like, I thought we had a few more hours to go, and he said, no, we're only an hour away. And, I spent that hour kind of going, I can't believe this is about to happen, and climbed over the Hillary Step. And, I just remember taking those last few steps onto the summit. And, for me, it felt like time just stood still when you get up there. It's just the most surreal place to be. And all you can hear is, I guess, your own thoughts and just the oxygen tank going. And, it was certainly incredible, and something that I had imagined for years. I'd imagined what that place would be like, what it felt like. So to then actually be standing there was pretty crazy. So, it was just an amazing experience. And you don't get long up there, so like 20 minutes, and you've got to be really careful of, how much time you're spending. And so once we had a moment to sort of take it all in, get some photos, it was like, all right, we got to head back down. And you feel the exhaustion as you're starting to descend the mountain. I think a lot of the adrenaline and excitement that pushes you up kind of just fades. And I think descending the mountain is a lot like being in survival mode. So now it was like, make sure you don't take any missteps, you don't, get too comfortable or relaxed, you've got to get back down. So, incredibly tough day. Our summit day, I think, was about 18 hours straight of climbing in total, because we went from Camp 4 up to the summit and then all the way back down to Camp 2 just to get out at the altitude. So incredibly tough day, but I remember just completely surreal climbing back down thinking I did it,
I mean, massive, massive congratulations.
Thank you.
What was the biggest challenge for you climbing Everest? What was the biggest challenge you needed to overcome?
Look, the financial side was up there, certainly. That definitely created a lot of stress, and that was a big challenge, like just getting onto the expedition. But I would say mindset. I think that's the biggest one. Yes, you need to be physically fit, and you need to, be consistent with that. But one thing I learned is you need to be able to use that under pressure. You need to be able to, in those moments where you are about to walk into the death zone and things could go wrong up here, I need to be able to handle myself. It totally comes down to mindset, in my opinion, and the way you sort of handle that, and whether that's something that does sort of crush you, or you take that and decide to use that and harness it. I definitely think the mindset is a big part of it. Once I got to base camp and, it was the summer push and it was time to go, I felt like I knew I was ready. And I think that came from the years of preparation and definitely my mindset. I felt like Yeah, I was ready to go. Like nothing could be thrown at me in the next week that I wasn't like I felt that I was capable of handling anything that was thrown at us. So I definitely think it's mindset.
Climbing Everest at such a young age, how has that impacted on the rest of your life?
Look, it's been incredibly challenging, probably in ways that, outside of the expedition, I really didn't see coming. I think I didn't really have any major expectation of what life was going to be like post Everest because I couldn't even imagine that. I didn't know how I was going to feel. I didn't know, what was going to happen on the mountain. And so I think the biggest challenge is having this almost like life defining huge goal, which is great, but then all of a sudden it's done and it's gone. And if there's anything I've learned over the last few years, it's that you do need to find just things in your life that make up who you are and kind of give them more time and energy. I think probably one of the biggest things I struggled with was finding a purpose that felt, as big as that and that I was connected to. So I've learned not to compare everything else I do to Everest. I try and let that, I guess, be its own thing. And for a while I sort of felt the pressure of, do I need to have a big goal all the time? And no, for me, it's like, no, you don't, but, find things that make you, I guess, excited and fill your time and energy with stuff that you love to do. I think that's probably what I've learned over the last few years since Everest.
What do you love to do? What does make you excited?
Yeah, so really, I'd say I've implemented that probably only this year. So I've just started going to uni. I'm doing a degree in psychology. So that'll be me for the next few years. I'm into that now, at the start of that process. But for me, it's also a lot of the simple things that, particularly when you do have these big goals, can be quite easy to overlook. But, for me, it's just going and spending time with my mum and my siblings, having a movie night, going out to restaurants, places that I like, with friends. It's training in the gym. I always enjoy my physical training, even if I don't have a particular purpose for that. And so, for me, it's just filling my time with all the small things I enjoy doing as well.
Yeah. How's uni going?
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, I'm really enjoying it. Just started not long ago, so I'm into a lot of study. So, but I love it.
Why did you decide to pick psychology?
Well, there were a few degrees I looked at. For me, I think that one will be the most relevant, and I just enjoy learning about it. I think because a lot of the stuff I read, in particular, obviously towards sports psychology, I look back and go, oh, I used that, or I did that, or so you can kind of piece together and communicate what you've already used in real time. I just find it fascinating, and I guess a lot of my life I've been around that stuff, but also off the back of Everest, I do a lot of, public speaking engagements, and I just find it helps me to communicate, I guess, what I've already done.
Yeah. What are the big dreams? Because you're how old are you now? Are you
23.
23. So you're 23 years old. The world is your oyster. What are some of your future dreams and ambitions that you'd like to achieve or like to do?
Yeah, look, I don't have a lot, as in it's, not this long list for me. I find that naturally I do tend to get totally immersed in sort of one or two things. I tend to try and keep my focus toward a couple of things because that's what I really enjoy. I like those big goals that you've really got to chip away at. And so for me, definitely is, finishing my uni degree, but also there's other climbs on my radar. For me, I love the 8,000 metre peaks. The 14 of the world's highest mountains, Everest being one of them, but there's a few other of those that I would love to climb. Certainly on my radar at some point, I'd like to go to Makalu and Choyu, the 5th and 6th highest mountains in the world. And from there, we'll sort of see where it goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely inspiring. And Alyssa, I'd love for you to final words of advice for women and girls about doing scary things. What advice would you have for them?
My advice would be, and it's certainly challenging on how to do it, but I certainly think probably the most important thing for me was learning how to back myself and believe in myself. I think, if you're going to confront scary things, obstacles, I do think you have to believe in you and see yourself overcoming it. That certainly for me was how a lot of the obstacles I've been through were achievable and were manageable, and how I got through it. I think you learn how to believe yourself in the process as well. So it can be a bit of a catch-22, but I'd say get started. If something interests you, is important to you, I think that'll give you the drive to overcome something that's scary.
Yeah. And Alyssa, how can people follow along with you and keep updated with future challenges and adventures?
Yeah, so really the main two pages would be, I've got a Facebook page that certainly always have expedition updates when I'm climbing. So that's just Alyssa Azar, ALYSSAAZAR. And that's just an open page. And then also on my Instagram account, same name.
Fantastic. Alyssa, thank you so much for giving your time to come and talk to us today on the Tough Girl podcast. I mean, massive congratulations about what you've achieved. It is so, so inspiring, and best of luck with your degree and best of luck with all of your future adventures and challenges.
Thank you.
Tribe, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Alyssa. What an absolute inspiration. So everything that we have talked about today will be available in the show notes at toughgirlchallenges.com. Now, if you are interested in mountaineering, let me just share a few other names of women that I've interviewed for the Tough Girl podcast who've also sort of climbed Everest or are going after the Explorers Grand Slam. So you can take a listen to Cathy O'Dowd, who was the first woman to summit from both sides. So Alyssa is the youngest woman, but Cathy was the first woman to do that. She came on the Tough Girl podcast in 2016. We've also spoken to Jo Bradshaw quite a few times now, actually, as she goes after her 7 summits attempt. Jo was there during the earthquake in 2015, and she talks about that in the episode in 2016. And there's also a Tough Girl Extra episode where Jo shares more about summiting Mount Everest. We've spoken with Tori James, Squash Falconer, Tashi and Nunshi Malik, the twins who've also completed the Explorers Grand Slam. That episode came out in July 2017. I didn't actually interview any women in 2018 who climbed Mount Everest, but I had quite a few in 2019. So we talked to Dr. Joyce Azam, who was the first Lebanese woman to climb Everest, and she's also going after the 7 summits. That episode came out in August 2019. We spoke with Holly Budge, who skydived from Mount Everest, Georgina Miranda, who's going after the Explorers Grand Slam. She's done 6 of the 7 summits. We've also spoken with Molly Hughes, who's the first British woman to summit Mount Everest, and Molly's just also come back from doing the Antarctic, doing a solo crossing of Antarctica, and we'll be catching up with her for an episode of Tough Girl Extra. And in January 2019, we spoke with Bridget Muir, who was the first Australian woman to climb Mount Everest. So if you are interested in Mount Everest, although I do find obviously it's fascinating hearing about Everest, but it's everything else that goes into it. It's the mindset, it's the physical preparation, it's the logistics. So everything that these women can talk about while going after this big goal, you'll be able to apply that to your own personal goals and challenges, because I totally get that not everyone wants to go and climb Mount Everest, but you can still pick and choose those bits that really sort of apply to you. For example, during this episode, the one thing that stood out to me was the perfect performance line. I'd never actually heard that before, so I found that really, really interesting. And I think there are, these gems throughout all of the podcast episodes. There's now over 300 episodes of the Tough Girl podcast that you can go and listen to. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Massive thank you to all of my patrons for your ongoing support. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to support the Tough Girl podcast, please do go visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl podcast. Sign up at $5 a month. It makes the world of difference. All that's left for me to do is to say have an amazing day wherever you are, whatever you are doing. Give it your all. Give it 110%. Get after it. Go for it. You've got one life. Get out there and live it to your fullest. Take care. Lots of love. And I'll be back with you next Tuesday for another awesome episode of the Tough Girl podcast. Bye.